You walk into the test center or log in at home, you've done the drills, reviewed your mistakes, maybe even hit your highest score on your last practice test. But then the first few sections hit you like a truck. They're technical, dense, full of layered conditionals and confusing number logic. No logic games, but somehow everything feels harder. And your brain goes, "What the hell is this? I've never seen this before." Now here's the truth. That moment, it was 100% predictable. LSAC has been testing these exact kinds of questions for months. The signs were all there, but most people just didn't notice, or they didn't know how to prepare. Let's make sure that's not you. Now, I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005. I personally went from a 152 to a 175. And since then, I've helped thousands of students do the same. But more importantly, I obsess over patterns. I track the subtle shifts in question trends, even when most students are focused on the obvious stuff. And right now, the August LSAT is giving off clear signals. This is not just another test. It is a new flavor of difficulty, and I want you to be ready for it. Let's talk about the biggest change everyone knows about, but few people fully understand. Logic games are gone. LSAC removed them a year ago. No more grouping, no more ordering, no more diagramming which dinosaur is which color. Now here's what most students miss. Removing logic games doesn't make the LSAT easier, it just shifts the difficulty. The LSAT isn't suddenly testing less logic. It's just spreading that logic across other sections, namely logical reasoning. In other words, they took all that complex thinking, the diagramming, the chains of rules, the if-then conditions, and they repackaged it. You're still being tested on the same core skills: conditional reasoning, understanding rules and exceptions, making inferences from limited information, spotting flaws in reasoning, and connecting abstract concepts. But now, instead of getting 4 logic games in one section, you're getting mini logic games embedded inside logical reasoning questions without warning. Think of it like this. Before, you had one section that said, "Hey, this is the logic-heavy part, be ready for it." Now, the logic is hidden. It's mixed in with everything else. No label, no warning, just dense abstract reasoning that looks like a regular logical reasoning question, but it plays like a logic game. This shift has a few major consequences for your prep. First, you've got to master formal logic inside logical reasoning now. If you used to skip those hard if A then B questions in logical reasoning, those are now key. LSAC has made them unavoidable. They're testing your ability to translate rules, diagram logic chains, and connect ideas in plain-looking questions. Second, the question difficulty has become less predictable. Before, many students paced themselves by spending extra time on games. That is gone. The difficulty now spikes later in the logical reasoning section without much warning. And it often comes from questions that look easy until you realize they're full of subtle logic traps. Third, you're now dealing with abstract content and formal reasoning at the same time. LSAC is layering challenges. It's not just about logic. It's about logic disguised in weird topics. For example, you might have a philosophy passage about free will that hinges on conditional chains, or a study about bacteria that hides a numeric percentage trap. This is by design. It forces you to process unfamiliar subject matter and apply abstract reasoning at the same time, and that's where most students freeze up. This trend is only accelerating. We've seen this shift brewing for a while. LSAC has quietly been testing these questions in the unscored experimental sections, and with logic games officially gone, they now have the space to double down. So if you're taking the August LSAT or any future LSAT, you've got to expect this style of question as the new normal, not an outlier. This is not just a couple of harder questions, it is a structural change in how the LSAT tests logic, abstract reasoning, and endurance. So, what should you do about it? First, stop avoiding dense logical reasoning questions and shift your practice towards more formal logic inside logical reasoning. And finally, start learning how to diagram within logical reasoning. This is how you stay ahead while everyone else is still prepping for the LSAT from 5 years ago. Let's zoom in on the actual format of the logical reasoning questions you're going to see on test day, because this is where the LSAT is really changing. Forget what you've heard about logical reasoning being short, everyday arguments. That is outdated. The new logical reasoning questions are denser, more abstract, more technical, and way more conditional. So if you're still expecting arguments about city council decisions and advertising campaigns, you're going to be caught off guard. Let me walk you through exactly what's changing and how it shows up on the test. First, more conditional statements. And you're not just seeing if A then B anymore. You're seeing if A then B unless C, but only if D, and not if E. You're seeing multiple rules layered on top of each other and exceptions to exceptions. And here's the trick. LSAC is not going to label these clearly. You've got to recognize the structure on your own, turn it into a diagram, ideally in your head, and then figure out what has to follow. This kind of reasoning used to be limited to logic games, but now it's all over logical reasoning. So you've got to get faster at spotting trigger words like only if, unless, if but only if, and without. And you've got to be able to translate these fluently, or you're going to get lost halfway through the stimulus. Now, these aren't traditional logic puzzle setups. They're camouflaged as real-world situations or academic arguments, but the reasoning underneath is formal logic. So, for example, you might have a scenario about voting preferences that becomes a logic chain. The LSAT writers want to see if you can extract structure from chaos, if you can separate the language from the logic. So what you need to do when a stimulus seems hard, pause and ask yourself, what are the underlying rules here? Is this cause and effect, correlation, necessity, or sufficiency? What is being assumed that I can break down into a logical form? Don't get distracted by the surface story, look for the bones underneath. Now, numbers and percentages also are more important than ever. They used to be pretty rare, they have become a lot more common. You're going to see stats that look intuitive, but are actually misleading. You're going to see group size mismatches that twist your assumptions, and you'll see more likely versus more people comparisons. LSAC loves to combine these with causal arguments or flaw questions. For example, let's say you had a scenario where they said 60% of Group A prefers X, while only 30% of Group B does. But you've got to consider the relative sizes of those groups. So if Group A only has 10 people, but Group B has 1,000 people, Group B would still actually have way more people preferring X, even though the percentage of those who do is a lot smaller. So anytime you see numbers or percentages, you've got to ask, do I know the total group size? And check if they're comparing proportions or totals. And above all else, be skeptical, especially if they use percentages to prove a conclusion. Now, abstract topics are a distraction on purpose, and this is a big one. LSAC wants to overload your brain. They want the topic to intimidate you so you forget to look for the logic. They are never testing your knowledge of the topic itself. They're testing whether you can stay focused on the structure. So don't waste time trying to understand the topic. Instead, zero in on the argument. What's the conclusion? What's the support? And what are the related assumptions? And translate anything you don't recognize into placeholders. Composer X could just be person A. Microbial fermentation rate could just be thing increasing over time. Don't let the obscure content distract you from clean reasoning. Now, the hidden cost of all these changes is that everything now requires more mental stamina. The test feels longer, not because there are more questions, but because each one now requires more cognitive effort. You'll need more time per question. There's more logic in each paragraph, and you need more endurance across the section. You can't just wing it on those last few questions anymore. They're often harder than the first ones, so you've got to drill logic-heavy questions back to back. You've got to practice full sections, not just questions in isolation, and you've got to learn to spot when you're mentally fading and find a way to reset. Because this is not just about getting better at logical reasoning. It's about learning how to unpack formal logic hidden in complexity, under pressure, and with unfamiliar topics and layered rules. That's what the August LSAT and every future LSAT is starting to look like. And the students who learn to adapt, They're the ones who walk in and feel like the test is easier than expected while everyone else panics. Now, if you're still using LSAT prep methods from even 3 years ago, you're training for a version of the test that no longer exists. A lot of students are doing what used to work. They're reading one prep book cover to cover, they're memorizing strategies without applying them, they're grinding logic games every day, even though logic games aren't even on the test anymore, and they're skipping the formal logic-heavy questions because they're too confusing. Now, that plan might have been fine when logical reasoning was easier, but now, that same study plan is going to leave you exposed because the LSAT has evolved and your prep has to evolve too. The LSAT now rewards depth over breadth. It is not about doing 3,000 questions. It's about deeply understanding how 100 of them really work, especially these new logic-heavy ones. So don't just study harder, study smarter. Study for the actual test you're going to see. Update your prep materials, update your drills, and update your strategies. The shift is not going away, but if you lean into it, you're going to separate yourself from the vast majority of students who are still prepping like it's 2018. Let me say something that might sound annoying at first, but it's true. If you're not diagramming formal logic on the LSAT, you're leaving points on the table. And no, doing it in your head doesn't really count. I don't care how good your reading skills are. I don't care if you were great at logic games. I don't even care how smart you are. If you see a logical reasoning stimulus that says, quote, if this policy is implemented only if the committee approves it, and the committee doesn't approve policies that increase spending unless they include budget offsets, and you're not sketching that out, you are going to make a mistake. Maybe not on that question, but eventually. Because the LSAT is betting you'll get tangled up in that mess of conditionals. So here's the new rule. Diagramming is not optional anymore. You used to be able to take a dense, layered stimulus full of only if, unless, if but not both, and translate it into something visual. And you need to be able to do it fast. Now, I'm not saying you've got to build a perfect little chart every time. I'm saying you need to externalize the logic. Get it out of your head and put it on paper. Use arrows, use letters, use shorthand. Build a system that is simple, repeatable, and scalable. But here's the key. You've got to practice this before test day. You cannot be figuring this out in real time when your adrenaline's spiking and the clock is running. So here's what I recommend. Pick 10 formal logic-heavy logical reasoning questions. Ignore the choices at first. Just diagram the stimulus, translate it, chain the rules, spot the contradictions, then check your work. Then go back and answer the question. Do that enough times, and you'll build speed naturally without rushing, without guessing. Because on test day, if you're thinking about how to diagram, you're already behind. You want diagramming to feel like breathing, automatic, fast, and clean. This one skill, this one habit can take you from lost and overwhelmed to sharp, fast, and in control. But only if you actually train it. So yeah, it feels clunky at first. But you know what feels worse? Getting the question wrong because you tried to wing it. Practice diagramming until you don't need to think about it. Then it becomes your advantage. Now let's talk about numbers versus percentages. Just because something is 90% doesn't mean it's more than 30%. Now that might sound obvious when you hear it like that, but the LSAT uses this trap over and over again, and it fools smart students all the time. And here's why. Most people are used to hearing stats like 80% of people agree, and immediately assuming that means a lot of people. But on the LSAT, the percentage is meaningless unless you know the total group size. Let me show you how this plays out and how to protect yourself from falling for it. LSAC loves to give you a setup saying something like 90% of participants in Group A supported the policy and only 35% of Group B supported it. And most students will immediately assume Group A had more supporters. But they leave out one key thing, the size of each group. So let's say Group A has 10 people, so 90% of that group would be only 9 people. In contrast, Group B has 100 people, and so 35% of Group B would be 35 people. So now it's obvious that Group B had more supporters by a long shot. But because most students stop at the percentages, they never check the math. They just move on with a wrong assumption. Now, this trap shows up across the logical reasoning section. You'll see it in strengthening questions when you're evaluating claims based on survey data. You'll see it in weakened questions that challenge assumptions using stats. And you'll see it in inference questions that ask you what must follow from a set of percentages. And LSAC, of course, doesn't really care how good you are at math, but they do care whether you understand the difference between proportional reasoning and absolute reasoning. And they want to know, can you spot when the test is trying to blur the line between the two? So here are the 3 types of number-based traps you'll see. The first is proportion versus total confusion. They'll give you percentages, but no totals. And your job is to realize that without knowing group size, you cannot draw conclusions about total numbers. So let's say, for example, they said 70% of law school applicants from college X were admitted, but only 50% of applicants from college Y were. It might sound like college X did better, but what if college X had 10 applicants with 7 admitted and college Y had 200 applicants, meaning that 100 were admitted? Now, who's sending more students to law school? College Y. Second, let's look at changes in percentage versus change in total. So let's say a group increases from 40% to 60%. So you think they're gaining popularity. But again, without knowing the base, you don't actually know if the total increased or decreased. Sometimes the group got smaller overall, but the proportion went up. That doesn't necessarily mean it got more support, just a different distribution. And finally, third, we have misleading averages. If Group A has 10 people earning $10 and Group B has 1 person earning $100, their average income is the same, but the distribution tells a very different story. The LSAT uses this trick to test assumptions in economics, business, or survey-based arguments. So anytime you see numbers or percentages in the argument, you want to stop and ask, do I know the total group size? If not, I can't make definitive claims about quantity. You want to know, am I comparing percentages or absolute numbers because they are not interchangeable? You want to ask, what assumption is the argument making about this comparison? Are they assuming the base rates are equal when they're not? And finally, you want to ask, can a different group size flip the conclusion? Often, yes, it can. And that's what makes this a perfect weekend question. This kind of thinking, if you master it, will make you bulletproof on stats-related questions. Now, you don't need to memorize formulas here. You've just got to get fluent in spotting flawed reasoning. So here is how to practice. You want to grab 5 to 10 questions that use survey data, percentages, or numerical comparisons. Then you want to force yourself to calculate the implied totals, even if they're not directly provided. Then you want to practice rewriting the argument with actual numbers to see if it still holds. You will start to notice, if you do this, how often the test makes subtle shifts in phrasing to confuse you. You will see how your brain wants you to accept that percentages equal absolute numbers even without proof, and how dangerous that assumption is under timed pressure. Now remember, this is not about math. It's about logic. And LSAC loves using numbers to mess with your reasoning. And most students never train this skill because it feels minor or just too hard. But it's not. There's at least one of these questions on almost every single LSAT, and you can learn this. And if you get it right, while others fall for the trap, that is a free point. Raw score, which means that could be a 171 instead of a 169. Now let's talk about inference questions. Most students treat inference questions like they're the easy ones. The question stem says something like, which one of the following must be true? And students think, great, all I've got to do is read and find something that matches the facts. But then they get it wrong. Why? Because inference questions are not about reading comprehension. They're about logical precision under pressure. The test gives you 3 to 4 facts, some of which seem random, some conditional, some statistical, and you're supposed to connect them to figure out what must be true based on the evidence and only the evidence, and that's harder than it looks. In the old days, inference questions were often short and straightforward, but now LSAC is layering in more conditionals that you might want to diagram, abstract terms with hidden definitions, quantifiers like some, most, all, and none, each with specific logic rules, and to top it all off, unfamiliar topics to throw you off. The goal here is not just to test whether you understand what the stimulus says, it's to see whether you can resist making assumptions, avoid conclusions that are too strong, and spot connections hidden in plain sight. So here's how to break inference questions down step by step. You want to think of yourself like a detective. You're not guessing, you're gathering evidence. Here is your process. First, you want to ID every premise. Go through the stimulus sentence by sentence and ask yourself, what is this fact saying? Is it conditional, quantitative, or comparative? Don't rush it here. You can't connect the dots if you haven't noticed the dots. Then you want to translate anything that requires it. If a sentence says, only if the funding is approved will the project begin, you've got to translate it as project, then funding approved. Same with unless, most, at least one, and none. If you can clean up the logic, you're going to make fewer mistakes. Then you want to look for overlaps. Are two facts talking about the same group? Can you chain conditionals together? Is there a contradiction that rules out an answer? This is where most inferences live, in the intersection of two seemingly unrelated facts. Then you want to ask, what must be true? Not what seems likely, not what could be true. Ask, if all of this is 100% true, what else is guaranteed to follow? This will eliminate trap answers that are tempting but go too far. Then you want to eliminate extreme or unverifiable answers. You want to watch out for words like always, never, completely, and proves. If the facts don't fully support it, it's out, and you will often find 2 to 3 tempting answers that feel close, but only one of them is airtight. Now here are 3 actual LSAT questions that showcase this kind of logical inference. In Prep Test 111, there's a question about inspired musical performances. In Prep Test 117, there is a numbers and percentages question about Clara Schumann and concert attendance. And in Prep Test 130, there is a tough formal logic sufficient assumption question about handmade wigs. These are not just random questions, they are old ones that represent exactly the future direction the LSAT is going in. Dense logic wrapped in unfamiliar content. So here is how to practice this skill, because you don't want to just do more questions. That is passive. Instead, pick 10 inference questions from recent prep tests. For each one, break down the stimulus word for word, diagram conditionals and quantifier words where you need to. Then write out your own predicted inference before looking at the choices, and eliminate each wrong answer by explaining what it assumes or where it overreaches. And keep a mistake log specifically for logic errors, where, for example, you assumed X without proof, where you confused most with all, or where you didn't notice overlapping terms. That kind of review will sharpen your logic and build up your confidence. Now, inference questions are not gimme questions, they are traps disguised as gifts. But the good news is, once you start treating them like logic puzzles, they become predictable. Every conditional has a structure, every quantifier has a rule, and every conclusion has a logic flaw you can avoid. So slow down, think like a detective, and trust the process. This is how you rack up easy points while everyone else gets baited by extreme answers. Now let's say you understand conditional logic. You've got diagramming down, you've drilled inference questions, numbers versus percentages, and yet your practice test scores are stuck. You're making errors you didn't make untimed, and you're running out of time. You're second guessing yourself on questions you know how to do. What's going on? You're probably making one of the most common and costly mistakes students make. You're skipping timed practice. Now here is the brutal truth about the LSAT. The second the timer starts, everything changes. You're not just solving questions anymore. You're juggling time, pacing, fatigue, confidence, and self-doubt. Without timed reps, your logic skills stay fragile. They only work under perfect conditions, but test day is the exact opposite of perfect conditions. And unless you've trained under pressure, your accuracy will collapse the moment the clock starts ticking. So let's say you get a question right in 3 minutes. You understand the stimulus, you diagram carefully, and you eliminate confidently. Awesome, right? Not really, because on test day, you get approximately 1 minute and 25 seconds per question. That same question might turn into a rushed guess, a brain freeze, or a skipped bubble. Now, multiply that by 7 to 10 hard questions across the whole section, and suddenly you've lost a huge chunk of your score. Not because you didn't know the logic, but because you couldn't execute it fast enough. Untimed practice is great for learning, but timed practice doesn't just build speed, it teaches you to let go of perfection, to make educated guesses with confidence, and to stay calm when a question looks unfamiliar. Now, you don't need to jump into full-timed sections right away. You could start small with high-intensity reps. So doing microsets, for example, where you pick 5 logical reasoning questions, set a timer for 8 minutes, and work straight through and review immediately after. This builds pacing and stamina without burning you out. You could also do logic-heavy clusters to target your weak areas, where you do 5 conditional reasoning questions with a strict timer, then 5 inference questions, then 5 flaw questions. This helps you get faster at the specific logic patterns you see most often. Now, once you've built rhythm in smaller sets, move on to full sections. 25 questions in 35 minutes. Here, you are simulating real conditions. Your phone is off. You're not pausing for any reason. Then you review everything, even the ones you got right. You ask, where did I lose time? Where did I hesitate? And where did my logic break down under pressure? That's where the real learning happens. Now, every time you finish a timed section, record how many you completed, how many you got right, where you lost time, and what kind of questions slowed you down. Patterns will emerge, and once you spot them, you can fix them. Now, when you actually train under pressure, you stop rushing easy questions, you spot trap answers faster, and you make better decisions about when to guess and move on. You will also feel calmer even when the clock is ticking, and your score will start rising. Not because you got smarter, but because you got sharper.